financial transactions using terminology that reveal political interest? I would love to hear a response to that. If true, this is a gross abuse of power. FinCEN was created to stop money laundering and not to spy on Americans. It was not created for political motivation. So I conclude with this. America deserves better than what the Biden administration and the Department of Treasury has delivered to them.
Senator Scott, Janet, Secretary Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, please proceed. Thank you for joining this committee again.
Thank you. Good morning. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. Over the past 3 years, the Biden administration has driven an historic recovery. GDP growth is strong and inflation has declined significantly. We've also achieved a healthy labor market. The prime age labor force participation rate is up by over 2 percentage points from January 2021. The unemployment rate remains below 4%, continuing the longest streak in 50 years. Real wages have increased. Household median wealth has too, by 37% between 2019 and 2022. That's the largest 3-year increase on record. Families are now putting their additional income and accumulated savings back into the economy. Our continued economic strength depends on a solid and resilient U.S. financial system. Throughout 2023, the Financial Stability Oversight Council monitored a wide range of risks, including risks stemming from commercial and residential real estate sectors and from global geopolitical conflicts and technological developments. When 2 regional banks failed last March, we acted quickly to prevent contagion to banks with similar vulnerabilities and to maintain confidence in the banking system. The Council also increased transparency this year, issuing an analytic framework that for the first time provides the public with in-depth information on how it monitors, assesses, and responds to potential financial risks. Let me now highlight 5 areas of ongoing work that are further detailed in the Council's 2023 annual report. First, the Council is focused on risks from the banking sector and from non-bank financial institutions. It supports member agencies' plans to review whether capital measures appropriately reflect the banking institution's ability to absorb losses, improve resolvability at large, complex, or interconnected banks, and address vulnerabilities from uninsured deposit levels and depositor composition. Non-bank financial institutions are an important source of capital in financial markets, but also pose potential risks to the financial system, including risks related to liquidity mismatch and leverage. Securities and Exchange Commission initiatives focused on hedge funds, money market funds, and other investment funds are an important step forward here. Second, the Council is focused on member agencies enhancing assessment efforts and increasing coordination around climate-related financial stability risks from increasingly severe and frequent climate-related events. Financial regulators should also continue to promote disclosures that allow investors and financial institutions to consider these risks in their investment and lending decisions. Third, a key focus has been bolstering protections against cybersecurity risk. The Council promotes sharing timely and actionable cybersecurity information, including through ongoing partnerships between state and federal agencies and the private sector. Fourth, the Council is closely monitoring the increasing use of artificial intelligence in financial services. which brings potential benefits such as reducing costs and improving efficiencies, and potential risks like cyber and model risk. Financial institutions, regulators, and market participants should continue deepening their expertise and monitoring capacity in this area. And fifth, the Council is focused on digital assets and related risks, such as from runs on crypto asset platforms and stablecoins, potential vulnerabilities from crypto asset price volatility, and the proliferation of platforms acting outside of or out of compliance with applicable laws and regulations. Applicable rules and regulations should be enforced, and Congress should pass legislation to provide for the regulation of stablecoins and of the spot market for crypto assets that are not securities. We look forward to continuing to engage with Congress on this. With this overview, I look forward to taking your questions on these and other areas.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen. Secretary Yellen, again, has been very flexible in scheduling this. We moved the hearing to 9 o'clock because she wanted as much time as possible. She has to leave by 11:30 exactly. I will enforce the 5-minute rule on myself and on everyone else. Last March, you and the banking regulators, after a banking crisis, had to step in and stabilize the system. It's a pattern we see all too often. Executives take outside risk to enrich themselves and rarely suffer consequences. 14 years ago, Congress gave FSOC important authorities to impose safeguards of the biggest, riskiest non-bank financial firms. Secretary Yellen, why are FSOC's designation authorities important for ensuring that Wall Street is accountable when it puts our financial system at risk?
Thank you for that question. I think if we look back to the financial crisis in 2008 and recognize that in some investment banks like Lehman Brothers that were not banks at all, but rather shadow banks or non-bank financial institutions, had very little capital and were immensely highly leveraged. And their failure touched off a financial crisis, the likes of which we hadn't seen since the Great Depression. As you mentioned in your opening comments, the toll that this took on American workers and businesses was utterly enormous. The unemployment rate rose close to double digits, and it took almost a decade to recover from that. And so making sure we, of course, focus on the banking sector, but there are non-banks that can pose risks to their material distress or their failure can pose tremendous spillovers and risks to the entire financial system. And when the council identifies such a firm, designation may be the appropriate way to handle that. And Dodd-Frank created an ability for FSOC to designate such firms for supervision by the Federal Reserve, and they need to have higher risk management, capital liquidity standards.
Thank you. And we again assert that FSOC should follow through on its non-bank designation guidelines and make sure there's appropriate oversight of these companies. We know that terrorist groups like Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah have used digital assets to raise and transfer funds. We have important tools to counter illicit finance, but most of them date back to the post 9/11 era. As terrorists continue to innovate, do we need to update our counterterrorism tools, Madam Secretary, to respond to the risks created by digital assets?
We do have authorities, many authorities that enable us to act, but we've identified a number of holes in our authorities and have composed a list of suggestions for ways in which Treasury's authorities could and should be strengthened. And we look forward to working with you to try to accomplish
We,
that.
we will work with you on that. Some of it you can do as the Secretary of the Treasury. Much of it needs congressional authority. We will absolutely work with you. You've been cooperative all along. We will continue. My last question, it seemed like almost overnight last March, we learned the actions of a few executives, bank executives put the whole system under stress. Thankfully, the system stabilized. But I think as a lesson is that risk to our banks can build up and suddenly emerge without much warning. It's what happened last year. When our banking system faces unexpected stresses, explain to us how strong capital rules reduce systemic risk and help to protect depositors and small businesses.
Well, capital is available to absorb losses from unanticipated shocks. What happened last March is that a couple of banking organizations that had really mismanaged their interest rate risk, which is a classic risk, something in a rising interest rate environment can lead to either realized or unrealized losses for banks. Strong capital enables these banks to remain viable, not to fail. And unfortunately, Silicon Valley Bank touched off, it had enormous uninsured deposits, inadequate liquidity, and when it suffered these losses, it suffered a run. And that run threatened similar runs at other institutions that also had exposure to uninsured deposits. So the president and the Treasury and the regulators took actions to try to stem a systemic bank run. I believe we were successful in accomplishing that.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Senator Rounds of South Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Yellen, welcome to the committee. Senator Lummis had headed up a letter where there are 8 of us that had sent a letter in to you. The letter was asking that you would commit to a timeline for publishing FSOC's Section 123 report on the economic impact of regulation to address systemic risk. The analysis is critical at a time when financial regulators are pursuing complex changes to all parts of the financial system. The report is 3 years overdue, and your response to the letter would be requested fairly quickly. I would encourage you to direct the council to meet its statutory obligations in the next 6 months. And I would ask unanimous consent from the committee, Mr. Chairman, that the letter be entered into the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, I'm just going to start out, like I said, I got to ask you an easy one first. The FSOC 2023 annual report stated U.S. banks to continue to have sound levels of regulatory capital and healthy levels of profitability while maintaining ample liquidity buffers. As the chairwoman of the council, I think you would probably agree with the statement, correct? Okay. I also know that in the past, you've been very careful not to get into the middle of discussing the Basel III endgame discussions. I presume at this stage of the game, you don't want to comment on that at this point.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Nonetheless, it does seem to me that the fact that we make it very clear that the banks right now have sound levels of regulatory capital and healthy levels of profitability while maintaining ample liquidity buffers would seem to suggest that we may not need a whole lot of additional changes with regard to the Basel III endgame proposals. Secretary Yellen, fair to say that probably our government is not on a fiscally responsible path right now?
I do believe we need to reduce deficits and to stay on a fiscally sustainable path. Thus far, in real terms, the interest burden of the debt has remained within or below historical norms. And the president's budget last year suggested substantial deficit reduction that would continue to hold the level of interest expense at comfortable levels. But we would need to work together to try to achieve those savings.
You know, recognizing as part of the administration that that's part of the messaging that's out there, but it seems to me that the debt service costs on the Treasury securities increased by $237 billion year over year. Doesn't hardly seem to be sustainable.
Well, short-term interest rates have risen considerably as the Fed has tightened monetary policy. The expectations of, and actually long-term rates have risen too, but by somewhat less. The expectations of most forecasters and of CBO's recent analysis suggested that while interest rates are expected to be above the very low levels that they were at prior to the financial crisis, they are expected to decline somewhat.
I'd like to explore that just a little bit. My understanding is that to accommodate for the rising cost of servicing our debt, the Treasury Department announced last week another increase of its longer dated debt auctions. If we don't course correct, the federal deficit may very well reach a point where no one's willing to take on our government issued debt. Is that a possibility?
Um, It could, in an extreme case, be a possibility. I see no sign of that now. Our debt is highly valued, is the soundest and most liquid asset, not only for Americans, but around the world. But of course, we need to stay on a fiscally sustainable path.
But no, also if the Treasury auctions are such that perhaps there is less interest in that debt, would the Fed have to restart quantitative easing to accommodate it? And would you expect quantitative easing to be a part of the plans in the near future, in the next 2 years?
Well, I'm not going to comment on what the Fed will or should do. I would simply say, as you know, the Fed's responsibility is to maintain full employment and to hold inflation down. And I think that they would attempt to fulfill that congressional mandate.
Thank you. And these 5 minutes go by real fast, but thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Senator Reed of Rhode Island's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Madam Secretary, and let me commend you first for you and President Biden for a remarkable job. Unemployment is now 3.7%. It's been that way for 24 months. That's the longest stretch since 1960. So this administration has surpassed many administrations previously, both Republican and Democrat. Gross domestic product, GDP, is growing. And we've got expansion of the labor force. So by most statistics, and I would add, real wages have also grown. Is that correct? So, and we're seeing particularly the growth of real wages in minority communities, which frequently are the last if they ever get the benefits of expansion.
Yes, it's one of the fairest expansions we've ever seen, with disproportionate gains at the low end.
And that is a reflection of the policies that the President Biden has taken along with you, investing in the economy, of creating jobs, not simply hoping that it all trickles down from the select few.
That is absolutely correct.
Well, thank you very much. Let me change topics for a moment here. The Treasury Department released its annual National Money Laundering Risk Assessment for 2024. And the assessment notes that investment advisors to private funds, such as hedge funds and private equity funds, pose the highest risk of money laundering because they are exempt from AML, the anti-money laundering regulations. Can you describe the assessment, and does it represent a danger to the United States?
Well, I believe it does represent a danger to our financial system, and it creates holes that facilitate illicit financial activities. Investment advisors have never been subject to comprehensive industry-wide AML CFT regulations. And at this point, there is a kind of patchwork where some investment advisors implement some measures Some of them are duly registered as broker dealers or part of financial holding companies. But there are holes in this system which allow illegitimate or illicit investors to shop around for an investment advisor who doesn't inquire into their source of wealth. And Treasury is planning to issue a proposed rule that would apply AML-CFT requirements to those to investment advisors.
So essentially, it appears that some of these advisors who aren't subject to the regulation are taking the money of Russians, Chinese, et cetera, and moving it through hedge funds and essentially washing it here in the United States.
That's absolutely correct. And we have identified instances where investment advisors have worked with sanctioned individuals, corrupt officials, tax evaders, and criminals. And this is really a risk to us and to the globe we need to address.
Now, let me again switch gears. One of the issues I think we all face in our particular metropolitan areas is the falling demand for commercial real estate, which puts pressure on the banks that have lended to the developers, which puts pressures on the developers. Is the FSOC looking at this in a comprehensive way and it impacts on both the real estate sector and also the banking sector?
We have been looking at it in a comprehensive way and working with the bank supervisors to understand exposures. I believe we have discussed at almost all of our FSOC meetings this year, commercial real estate, and gotten reports and done our own analysis. And you're right that particularly for office buildings in metropolitan areas, vacancy rates have gone way up, especially for other than Class A buildings. And of course, interest rates are substantially higher, valuations are falling. And so it's obvious that there's going to be stress and losses that are associated with this. The banking supervisors are working with their banks to manage this risk, to identify it. I believe, this will not end up, I hope and believe it will not end up being a systemic risk to the banking system. The exposure of the largest banks is quite low, but there may be smaller banks that are stressed by these developments.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, very, very much.
Thanks, Senator Reid. Senator Kennedy of Louisiana is recognized.
Madam Secretary, I've watched you for years, even before I came to Washington. And
Oh, excuse me.
when I have time, I do. I enjoy reading your speeches. I think you're what cool looks like. You're a good sport to go out every day and try to defend Bidenomics. It's like trying to defend a fungal infection. Bidenomics is really just paying more to live worse, isn't it?
I certainly wouldn't agree with that characterization. Bidenomics first tried to address the pain that households were experiencing because of the pandemic and to help them survive it. Small businesses, households, people who had lost their jobs, to prevent the kind of scarring we saw after the financial crisis. And as the economy began to recover, and we quickly, of all advanced countries that experienced the pandemic, no country has done better than the United States in quickly having a labor market recovery, resuming growth, and we have the largest real wage increases of any advanced country. And then medium term, Bidenomics is focused on helping middle-class families lead better lives, address the problems that they have,
Well,
create
I
jobs
could
in
interrupt you,
areas.
Madam Secretary, because I've only got 5 minutes. Good try. These high prices are here to stay, aren't they? Let me amend that, Madam Secretary. These high prices caused by Bidenomics are here to stay, aren't they?
Well, the high prices were not caused by Bidenomics. We suffered a pandemic that resulted in severe
Yes, ma'am.
dislocations.
But if I could ask you, they're here to stay, aren't they?
I don't expect the level of prices to go down, but the rate of
So
inflation,
they're here to stay.
well, some prices will be higher than they were before the pandemic and will stay higher, but wages have risen considerably, and the pace of price increases has now receded. Over the last 6 months, the measure of inflation the Fed focuses on has been running exactly at
But if your
2%,
wages, if
and
you don't,
wages are going
if
up.
you don't get a pay raise, you're screwed. I mean, there's a difference between disinflation and deflation. Y'all talk about disinflation, which I'm happy to have. Disinflation means inflation is going down. It means prices are rising less rapidly than they were. But that's a far cry from deflation, which means the level of these high prices caused by Bidenomics are here to stay. Here's what Jay Powell just
Well-
said on February 4th. He said, he was asked the question, inflation is one thing, prices are another, and I wonder if there's any reason to believe that people will see the prices of things decline. And here's what Chairman Powell said. So the prices of some things will decline, others will go up, but we don't expect to see a decline in the overall price level. That doesn't tend to happen in economies, except in very negative circumstances. He's talking about a recession. It'll
Well-
take a recession to get these prices down.
Well, we don't have to get the prices down
Oh, we
because
don't?
wages are going up, and s- a metric that is worth knowing is that the median American house worker
But let me stop you
is
because I'm gonna
able
get cut
to
off.
buy
You don't
the-
think we need to get these prices down? You think it's okay that bacon's up 20% under
The-
President Biden? Chicken's up 23.5%, coffee's up 30%, gas is up 44%, new cars and trucks are up 20% because people can't afford that's used cars because people can't afford a new car. They're up 24% under Bidenomics. You don't think we need to get these prices?
wages are also up, and wages are up
They're not
more.
up 24%. They're not
Well-
up 27%. They're not up 23. They're
Well,
not
what
up
I'm
31.
sorry, but what is
People are really getting
what-
good at barely getting by because of Bidenomics.
American households have many pressures on their budgets, and President Biden is devoted to doing what we can as an administration, whether it's healthcare costs, insulin copays, energy costs, to getting these prices down and to helping American households afford a decent middle-class life. But what is true is that the median worker in the United States, if you compare today with 2019, can buy the same basket of goods with $1,400 left over to save or spend. So Americans, on average, are better off in spite of the fact that the level of prices is higher.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy.
Good try,
And
Madam
Senator Menendez,
Secretary.
New
Thank
Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since we're talking about questions of affordability, let's stay in that realm, but talk about something my Republican friends did not support. The American Rescue Plan, which I'm proud to have voted for and provided a historic increase to the child tax credit by boosting the credit to $3,600 for infants and toddlers and $3,000 for children, and paying those credits on a monthly basis. Child poverty decreased by 30% in 2021. In the same year, food insecurity decreased by 24%, the equivalent of 2 million fewer children going hungry. For parents, the CTC help paid for baby formula, childcare, and so many other things. Unfortunately, this critical lifeline ended for hardworking families across the nation at the end of 2021. Secretary Yellen, is it your opinion that the American Rescue Plan enhanced child tax credit is the reason for decrease in child poverty in 2021?
I believe that a recent study showed that about a half of the decrease in child poverty was directly attributable to the child tax credit. And there were other things that also served to lower child
And
poverty.
how many more children would be lifted out of poverty if the Bipartisan Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act was signed into law?
I don't know the exact numbers, but certainly additional
Well,
children would
based
be.
upon what we saw previously and looking at what the credit is devised in that legislation, to me, it is a proven track record of delivering brighter future for our children. And I want to thank the chairman for his continued work on this issue. I hope we can pass this legislation shortly. Climate change is causing the property and casualty insurance market to buckle under competing pressures to provide returns for shareholders and sell a product that policyholders can afford. As businesses, insurers have an obligation, obviously, to their shareholders to make a profit. But as policymakers, we have a right to be concerned when families can't afford or access necessary homeowners insurance coverage. Allstate and State Farm have stopped writing new policies in California. 15 other companies have stopped writing new policies in Florida. Insurance giant AIG plans to reduce their homeowners insurance business in communities across the United States: New York, Delaware, Florida, Colorado, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. 12% of homeowners have chosen to forego home insurance. So, Madam Secretary, can you discuss, as noted in the report, how climate risk drives a negative feedback loop to economic and financial stability?
Well, we're very concerned about the developments that you just cited. And of course, the absence of insurance or being priced out of insurance as these climate risks have intensified is harming the well-being of households and the cost of living. And it's also creating risk to financial stability because many banks have exposure through loans to the risks that can come if there are uninsured losses. And so there can be a feedback loop that works to disadvantage.
Between wildfires, droughts, flooding across the country for those who are deniers, you can see it before your eyes. If you have no insurance, then you put, for most American families, is the biggest single asset at risk at the end of the day. Finally, the FSOC report made some mention of the housing shortage when discussing vulnerabilities in the residential real estate market. But I worry that not enough emphasis is being placed on this crisis. Nationwide, we're facing a shortage of 3.2 million homes. This shortage is driving up the price of housing and placing vulnerable Americans, such as seniors and those with lower incomes, at risk. Do you agree that the housing shortage, if not addressed, could pose a serious threat to the economy? And if so, what do you think that Congress could do to help alleviate that circumstance?
Well, I certainly agree that this is an enormous problem for a very large number of Americans. President Biden has made a number of different proposals to attempt to address this that Congress hasn't passed. And I do think it's an area that requires very close attention and action by Congress to address.
Well, Choice Neighborhoods, Section 202 housing for the elderly, and a whole host of other things. And the Public Housing Fund is facing a $70 billion capital needs backlog. And the Section 202 program hasn't kept with the rising need for affordable senior housing. So I know the committee has jurisdiction over that. I appreciate the chairman has given housing more attention under his leadership. I hope we continue to do so.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Scott of South Carolina, ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, thank you for being here. Certainly, you and I would probably agree on one thing for sure, which is that the United States and a strong United States is a vital part of global security. And one of the challenges I have, as I started my opening statement with, as it relates to the Iranian regime's proxy attacks on our American soldiers, is the fact that this administration, under your leadership in the Treasury Department, has released $6 billion before the October 7th attack, $10 billion after the October attack, and $100+ billion as relates to the relaxation of the oil sanctions. And that to me leads to attacks from the Houthis. It actually is in part because this administration downgraded the Houthis from a terrorist organization, foreign terrorist organization. So when I look at the actions of this administration and I couple that with the resources released to Iran, the question I ask is, how do you continue to provide Iran with billions of dollars, knowing that they are the ones that are orchestrating attacks against our service members? And I assume your answer will in part be that some of those dollars are frozen, even though there have been a couple of opportunities and acts trying to access those resources. But we both understand the fungible nature of money. And so I'd love to hear your answer, number one. Number two, likely because I've spoken with you before during these hearings, you are very, very good. And therefore, I may have to cut you off.
Okay. So first of all, I want to say that the Treasury Department has been extremely aggressive and very vigilant about sanctions on the Iranian regime. We have worked very hard and had many sanctions actions addressed at Iranian oil shipments to try to do what we can to minimize revenues from oil. We have taken many actions in the aftermath of the attacks on Israel to close down channels for Hamas and other Iranian affiliated groups to use the financial system to fund their malicious activities. So I think the record is clear. We've done a great deal. With
Let-
respect to
Let me stop
the
there because
funds,
I do think you and I will not get to an agreement there. I do think that the record is clear that when you look at it, the net effect of the administration's actions has been more resources, more money for Iran, not fewer dollars. But I have two other subjects I want
Well,
to cover
but-
with you. Go right ahead.
could I just
Certainly.
quickly, the 6 billion that you're referring to were Iranian funds that were frozen in Korea. And we
Yes.
permitted these funds to be transferred to Qatar. They can only, when they were in Korea and now, can only be used for humanitarian purposes. And there are strict controls to make sure that they are directed only at humanitarian purposes.
Thank you. Let me
and
just
not
stop you
a
there.
dollar.
Mostly
none of it
because
has
I
been
have
spent.
very little time left, and the chairman is being very tough on us today as it relates to our time. So I will just respond by simply saying that if you give me $600 and I had a need, I would just use other money to deal with the need if you are trying to restrict the dollars. That's why I started the conversation with the fungible nature of dollars. But we do have another issue as it relates to the FSOC designations, the SIFI designations under FSOC. Under your direction, FSOC finalized guidance on a framework to evaluate non-bank financial firms for designation as a threat to our financial stability. If a company meets FSOC's new framework, it would be designated a SIFI and would be subject to Federal Reserve supervision and regulation. In 2019, FSOC issued a common sense proposal on this matter that evaluated firms based on their business activities, required a consideration of the firm's financial health, and perhaps most importantly, would have required the government to conduct a cost-benefit analysis prior to making any such designation. And recently, my understanding is that the way that you've restructured it, that no longer is the cost-benefit analysis necessary. No longer do you use the activities-based approach. Instead, due to, as I quote, unpredictability of the financial crises, such an analysis is not reasonably estimable, useful, or warranted in this context. So when you eliminate actual standards that people can understand, and you go to something far more flexible and subjective, I think it makes it even more difficult for companies to figure out when they are in threat and when they are not in threat of becoming a SIFI.
I don't know if I have time to answer this question.
The
There's
chairman
a
likes
great-
you a
Take your
lot.
time when you're answering. No, the answer is if, proceed.
We revised the 2019 guidance because it made it all but impossible to designate a firm as a SIFI, and deprived FSOC of a tool that Congress in Dodd-Frank clearly intended for it to have. Dodd-Frank does not require a cost-benefit analysis. It could have required it. It chose not to require it, and for very good reason. And you just cited the reason, which is we're talking about some cost to an individual firm, and the benefit is a reduced probability of a devastating financial crisis like the one we had in 2008 that can deprive millions and millions of hardworking Americans and businesses of their livelihoods. And to try to assign a number to what that benefit is, even now, if you ask researchers what is the what was the cost of the 2008 financial crisis, it was obviously huge, but to try to put a number on it is an artificial exercise. And it's clear that Dodd-Frank did not intend it. And with respect to an activities-based approach, the 2019 guidance said that there was a preference for an activities-based approach, and designation could only be used if an activities-based approach would not work.
Thank you.
And there is no preference here for designation. It is not a preferred
I s-
approach.
I certainly think of you as an expert at saying a lot, but let me just suggest that only the government thinks that figuring out the cost of something is unnecessary, and determining the activities that lead to the threat is unnecessary. That, from a business person's perspective, is remarkable.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Tester of Montana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and I want to thank you for being here. I very much appreciate, Madam Secretary. I want to talk a little bit about Russia and China, particularly China. There is no doubt that they want to replace us as the world's economic leader. I mean, that's a given. It is also a given that they're not going to play fair. They never have, and I don't think they ever will. I am pleased that the FSOC is focused on ensuring that we have appropriate mitigation and response management in place. But it's awfully hard to protect against threats that aren't on our radar. So, Secretary Yellen, do we have a good enough handle on where these threats from our foreign adversaries are directed? And what are you seeing as far as threats are concerned?
Well, FSOC is really only concerned with threats to the U.S. financial system. Now,
Correct.
cybersecurity that could involve China. There may be artificial intelligence we've identified as a threat, but China poses a number of threats that the Biden administration and the U.S. Treasury are concerned about and attempting to address that would not be in the domain of FSOC.
Amen. But from a Department of Treasury standpoint, do you feel you have a handle on these threats and where they're coming from? Because they continually, as it applies to our financial system, military is another situation, cyber is another situation, but as it applies to our financial system, because if they can undermine it, take away our confidence in it, they've gone a great step towards achieving their goal.
Well, we are particularly concerned about cyber threats, ransomware,
Yep.
and AI.
Okay, so let me talk about a different issue that Senator Rounds and I have been working on for a long time, and it is deals with 4 countries. Many of them have been already brought up today: North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China, as it applies to buying foreign farmland. we have, we have a bill. We've asked that CFIUS be really the lead on it. And I just kind of I want to get your help on this because quite frankly, we've got some pushback because CFIUS doesn't think this is in their purview. I personally think agriculture and food is national security. And I think there are dictatorships around the world that use food to control people. I don't want to be in that situation. Otherwise, our democracy will be gone. So the real question is when it comes to buying farmland and agribusiness, does CFIUS have the capacity to be able to analyze and make a determination what's going on
Well, CFIUS,
as
In-
it applies to farmland and agribusiness?
so as it applies to farmland, I believe CFIUS has the ability to review real estate
They
transactions
do.
if they're close to
Yeah, military facility.
identified sensitive
Right.
facilities
I'm talking
or
about,
ports.
I'm talking about everything in the United States, not just next to military facilities, which by the way, I don't think has been done very well. But I'm talking about even if they're buying it next to my farm, if it's a person connected with any one of these four countries' government, do we have the ability to make a determination?
Well, we do agree that food security
Yes.
is a national
Yep.
security issue. And I don't know that we would have the ability,
Right.
not near
Yep.
such
And
an
to
installation
be,
to,
to be honest with you, you may not. The question is what does Congress need to do to make it so that they have that ability? Because I think this is a serious, serious, serious problem. What do we have to do to make sure they have that ability? Do we have to fund them more? Do we have to put additional mandates on them? What do we have to do to make sure? Because I think they're concerned about right now semiconductors mostly, which I got no problem with that. But when it comes to farmland, agribusiness, what do we have to do to make sure that they're paying attention to this?
for CFIUS to take action
Yep.
on this,
Yep.
I think would require legislation. I know that you've been a
Yep.
leader in
Yep.
proposing such regulation.
Yep.
And I believe the Treasury Department has worked with you. We're certainly happy to.
Yep. So I appreciate that. And it is bipartisan. And I think it is a real threat that we need to take seriously. We just found out about a Chinese billionaire that bought 200,000 acres in Oregon. We didn't know a damn thing about it until after the fact. After the fact, it becomes a problem. We need to be more proactive. Thank you, Secretary Yellen, for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Senator Hester, thank you. And that Chinese billion, I spoke to the Farm Bureau in Columbus yesterday or a few days ago. And one of the things we're working on is not just prohibition, but actually having the data. And we will come to you and the administration about how to get that. We have a bill to do it, but it needs to be much more aggressive so we know what they're actually doing with all of their sleight of hand. Senator Smith of Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Secretary Yellen. It's so good to see you again. I
Thank you.
very
Nice.
much appreciate the chance to be with you. So I'd like to ask a little bit about some of the broader economic issues that we see ahead of us and maybe respond a bit to some of the questions that Senator Kennedy was asking you. So as the Fed has raised interest rates, a lot of economists predicted, of course, that the economy we'd be well into a recession by now, but that hasn't happened. In fact, the economy has been defying expectations. And this is driven, it seems to me, by historically strong consumer spending also that have really been driving economic activity and growth. And I think as you were attempting to point out, that since President Biden took office, wages have increased significantly for low and middle income earners. Do I have that right?
That is true.
Right. And I think that last year, nearly 60% of workers saw their wages outpace prices, surpassing pre-pandemic levels. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
So actually purchasing power, which is what matters, how much you can buy with the money that you have in your wallet is up. Is that not true?
Yes, it is. It's up. I think the number I mentioned is the median worker could buy the same basket of goods as in in 2019 and have $1,400 left over.
That's right. And I'm not an economist, though. I did take macroeconomics in college. And when you have price deflation, that is usually, I mean, what that means, in fact, is that the economy is shrinking and people are actually much worse off in that circumstance,
Of
right?
course,
That's right.
we've had a good, strong labor market and stellar growth.
Right, right. And of course, some would argue that the way that some prices have gone up, including food, for example, if you look at those price increases, and then I'm not asking you to comment on this, I'm just observing, you look at those price increases, and then you look at the massive increase in corporate profits, I would argue that that seems to be the driver of prices going up more than some of the more than the investments that the administration and Congress, Democrats in Congress, have made in the American people. But let me get to that, if I may. I'm interested to know what you think have been the impact of those big investments that Senator Kennedy was talking about that I'm really quite proud of. Big investments that we've made in Americans in infrastructure and broadband, in improving veterans' health care, in lowering the cost of prescription drugs, and bringing manufacturing and chips manufacturing back to the United States, for example. So could you talk a bit about what impact that you think has had on the historic recovery in our economy?
So I think the legislation is really a trifecta of legislation Congress passed: the infrastructure bill, the Chips and Semiconductor Act, and also the Inflation Reduction Act. We're seeing an investment boom, and it's creating very good jobs for many Americans in parts of the country that just haven't seen a lot of opportunity in recent decades. And the work we're doing shows that a disproportionate amount, both of the infrastructure spending and the investments we're seeing that have been announced because of the IRA,
Mhm.
are going to parts of the country where income is below average and infrastructure needs are greatest. So it's spurring job creation, and the benefits are being very widely shared.
And in fact, I think you referred to this in your opening testimony. If you look at the performance of the American economy compared to the performance of other economies around the world, we're doing much better.
Ours is the best.
And we also made significantly more of these sort of broad-based investments in the American people than other economies, other countries did, right?
Yes, we have. I think we've made very impressive investments. And if you just look at the Inflation Reduction Act, you see that it is sparking an enormous boom in clean energy across the spectrum, across the United States.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Butler of California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Madam Secretary,
you.
for your incredible service to our country in such a challenging time. I want to commend you and the Biden administration for the sound economic policies that we have in place. In short, what you have said and what I believe the FSOC report illuminates for all of us is that Bidenomics works. And that we have record low unemployment, a robust economic growth, rising wages. To pick up just where Senator Smith left off, I would love to give you the opportunity to say more, to just explain to the American people how these historic investments of the IRA and American Rescue Plan have contributed to the stronger economy and the stronger labor market. Just to give you some time to really delve into that and explain to the American people.
Well, one of the things I think that's been holding our economy back is a failure to invest in infrastructure. We used to be rated among the very handful of top countries around the world in terms of quality of our infrastructure, and our rank decreased because we had highly inadequate investment. And now we're seeing roads and bridges that have been falling apart, where affects commerce. People are caught for hours in traffic jams all across the country. We're seeing new infrastructure be built. And it's not just old infrastructure, but what a modern economy needs. Broadband, both the American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure bill are providing the funding to make sure that every American household has access to high-speed internet. I remember during the pandemic when we would read stories about families driving their kids to a McDonald's and sitting out in the parking lot so that they could do their homework, had access to broadband. That will be a thing of the past. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act are really making sure that the United States will play a significant role in it's a matter of national security, resilience of our supply chains, and making sure that we're creating good jobs in the industries that are going to be powering our economy in the years to come. And we are seeing the bill has very strong wage and apprenticeship standards for the entire clean energy set of investments. So we're making sure that the jobs that are created are good, high-paying, well-paying jobs, and that people get the training they need to be able to fill them. And there are many aspects of this legislation designed to ensure that all parts of the country benefit from it, and particularly parts of the country that just haven't really seen a lot of opportunity. And that would include energy communities that have been dependent on coal, and low-income communities where there are special bonuses for investing there.
Great. President Biden committed to the American people that he would build our economy from the bottom up and the middle out.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you helping to explain that a bit more to the American people. Two areas, Secretary, that I will just name and give you just a quick opportunity to respond, and we'll submit some further questions to you
Certainly.
for the record. Today, right now, as Senator Menendez pointed out in his earlier comments, the climate crisis is really at California's front door. The
Yeah, it is.
historic rains, 400 mudslides, 700,000 people without power today. As we sit here, the FSOC report has talked a lot about insurers, them leaving markets all across the country, including California.
Yeah.
I'd love to get your thought on how non-banking lenders and other sort of non-FSOC government agencies are working to integrate financial and climate data so that we could actually get your just again thoughts around how the health of banks and non-bank lenders will be affected by the lack of insurance being available.
Well, we're doing a great deal of work on that. In the Federal Insurance Office, OMB recently approved a survey that will be very granular at the zip code level to understand trends in insurance. The state insurance regulators, the NAIC, plan also to collect similar data. We're working with them, and what we'll get is a very granular understanding of what's happening to the availability and pricing of insurance. Policymakers, I think, as they begin to address what's becoming a crisis here, this is not straightforward to do, but we look forward to working with Congress to see what responses might be appropriate. And it will have an effect on banks. It raises the risks. And we're focused very heavily on the agencies working with the banking community so that banks understand how these developments are impacting. Well, it impacts the losses that a bank would experience from the lending that it's doing, and the value of homes and businesses that banks are lending to.
Thank you, Senator
Secretary.
Butler. Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto of Nevada is recognized.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, let me follow up on this same conversation because in Nevada, we have similar concerns. Quite often, it's been declared major disaster due to severe storms, flooding, landslides, mudslides, same thing I heard from my colleague. And one of the concerns I have is the possibility of changes in property and casualty insurance affecting the mortgage markets and home prices, right? That ultimately exacerbate the affordable housing crisis we see in Nevada and across the country. One of the recommendations, and you may have touched on this, is to enhance or establish information sharing protocols among federal and state agencies. What does that mean?
Well, we are going to try to collect data, as I mentioned,
Okay.
the Federal Insurance Office that gives us a lot of insight into this issue. And
With
this-
state agencies as well, is that part of the collaboration?
we would like to collaborate with state agencies. The states are the regulators of the insurance
Right,
industry
and they have
in the
central
United
data.
States.
Mhm.
And they're looking at these issues as well. And in order to reduce burdens on businesses and to make sure we have compatible data, we're trying to collaborate on this effort.
So for that reason, please let us know if we're particularly accessing that state data, and that collaboration is going to be key for us. So let us know
Yes.
how we can help if any way, please.
Very good, will do.
Thank you. Let me jump back to, I'm really interested, I think many of us are a year later now, how the regulators have worked to strengthen regulation and supervision to address what we saw happen in March 2023, the bank failures. My question to you is in response to the failures of Silicon Valley Bank, Signature, and First Republic Bank. How have the agencies altered their approach to supervision?
So, this is a matter for the individual agencies, but both the FDIC and the Fed have done and put in the public domain reports on what happened. And these reports include analysis of the failings, their own failings in terms of their supervisory programs. And clearly, as I believe they've testified, strengthening supervision so that they address taking more timely action. For
And I
example.
appreciate that. The question is that happening? In other words, are the bank supervisors, are the supervisors there, are they actually
I-
following through on the recommendations that we saw coming out of the FDIC and the Fed?
I believe that they are, but FSOC is not
Right.
attempting to engage in an independent assessment of the agencies. I think calling up those agencies directly and asking them for follow-up is probably
I
the
appreciate
best-
that. It helps to have an
best
independent
approach.
view of it, but I appreciate that. Let me jump to one final thing here. Non-bank mortgage originators and servicers. I see in the data that I'm sure you see as well, they continue to gain market share from banks over the last 10 years. Non-banks originated approximately 70% of single-family mortgages in the first half of 2023. Does this shift away from banks to non-banks pose a financial stability risk due to non-banks' lack of access to deposits for short-term financing? Is this a concern? Is this something that we should be looking into as well?
Senator, yes, it is. And FSOC is very focused on that because non-bank mortgage companies lack access to to deposits which banks have. They're reliant on short-term financing that may be a lot less stable than deposits. And in stressful times, their credit lines can be pulled. They don't have access to the kinds of liquidity backstops that banks have as well, such as the Fed's discount window. They tend to have very limited capital and loss absorbing capacity, and mortgage service rights are a less liquid asset. So there is concern that in stressful market conditions, we could see the failure of one of these. And as you said, this has become very, very significant in the mortgage market.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Warner from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, it's great to see you. I'm going to bounce around a little bit today on a series of questions, so I appreciate you hanging in with me. A number of colleagues have already talked about financing of terrorism. Yesterday, Treasury did issue annual risk assessments for illicit finance in the wake of the horrific Hamas attack. Yesterday's risk assessment states that Hamas is a well-resourced group that garners substantial financial resources from numerous and divisive sources, use complicit virtual asset service providers, and money transmitters through global to move funds. Remarkable thing is back in 2016, the United States put secondary sanctions in place for Hezbollah. But here we are now 120 days after the horrific attacks of October 7th, and we still haven't put secondary sanctions in place for Hamas or, for that matter, any other foreign terrorist organizations. So we've tried to put an end to that together with Senator Rounds, Reid, and Romney. I've introduced Senate Bill 3441, the Terrorist Financing Prevention Act, to help address this program. This would make sure that all foreign terrorist organizations would be covered, and it would be able to have them go after not only their secondary banking, but also their ability to use crypto. I really appreciate that Treasury has helped a lot with technical assistance on this piece of legislation, but I want to give you the opportunity now to speak to this issue and whether you think this kind of legislation is needed, because our understanding is, without it, you can't put in place this full bevy of sanctions.
I would agree that there are limitations the Treasury faces, and we certainly support the aims of the bill. They would help give us authorities that would enable us to better deal with a very significant threat.
I'm going to count that as an endorsement. I'm going to move to another topic, artificial intelligence. FSOC report identifies AI as a major risk for the financial sector. Matter of fact, I've been surprised that we have not seen more use of AI tools on market manipulation already. And I sometimes fear that they may be happening, and they may not be Fortune 100 companies, but Fortune 200 to 500 companies. And we may find that it's happening real time. As somebody that was very involved in Dodd-Frank with the creation of FSOC, I have to say I think its record so far has been a little bit mixed. But boy, oh boy, if there was ever a case to look across all the regulatory entities within the financial sector, a problem like AI, I think would be perfectly suited for FSOC. Again, I've got bipartisan legislation with Senator Kennedy that would have FSOC play that coordinating role on AI, as well as look at some of the issues that already exist in securities law around market manipulation, but increase the penalties if AI tools are being used. So, Madam Secretary, do you agree that this is an area where Congress should move quickly to make sure that we've got a comprehensive approach for both the upside and the downside of AI in the financial sector?
I think the administration would welcome a congressional initiative in this area. And FSOC this year identified AI as a vulnerability that could create systemic risk. So we're working very hard to deepen our understanding of the ways in which that could happen and to monitor very rapidly changing developments to be able to define best practices for financial institutions.
Again, we've worked closely with your office, but I hope you'll take time to look at Senator Kennedy and I's bill. And I think it's at least a good starting point for giving you the tools, and frankly, us having the guardrails. Last question, something I've raised with particularly our friends over at the Fed. As we think about how we prevent future SVBs, and there's been recent reports even now that one of the banks that took on some of the assets of Signature might be having some challenges, is we might need new regulation, but we ought to use some of the tools that are already out there. Discount window. It has been repeatedly reported that the discount window, a lot of these banks that fell into disrepair didn't even have a process in place. I think we need to go beyond some of the guidance that's been given and actually potentially even make mandatory usage of the discount window so we can make sure that it's easily used. I know people are concerned about any kind of reputational risk, but can you speak to this issue and how we can make sure that banks utilize this tool that's been set up since the beginning of the Fed?
Absolutely agree. And inadequate access to liquidity because of a failure by banking institutions to post collateral with the Fed in a timely way. This is something that I think is being reviewed, and it would not surprise me to see new initiatives in this area. So it's a critically important matter.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Warren of Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you, Secretary Yellen. So today I want to talk about the 1%ers, not the billionaires, but the billionaire banks. America has more than 4,700 banks, but the ones that have the power to crash our economy and the ones that get government bailouts are not the community banks. No, the ones that pose a threat are the giant banks, the multi-billion-dollar banks. So the Fed has proposed increased capital standards to make these giant banks hold more capital. And it turns out that even among those billion-dollar banks, nearly 90% already hold enough capital. So what we're really talking about here is just a handful of the biggest banks that would have to hold a little more capital. Secretary Yellen, I just want to start by making sure I've got my facts right. Would the new Basel III rule on capital standards have no impact on community banks and, in fact, only make a handful of giant banks hold more capital?
Well, its terms apply to banks with more than $100 billion or significant trading activities, and community banks have far lower assets, and I'm not aware of any who
Okay.
have those.
So this is not about our community
Not
banks.
about.
This is about our biggest banks. Why is it so important for these giant banks to hold more capital?
Well, capital is a measure of the resources a bank has to absorb losses in the face of a shock. It's even in normal times, capital is something a bank has to have in order to lend. And so it's critical to meeting the borrowing needs of households and businesses throughout the economy. When a shock hits, like we saw in the financial crisis, a bank can fail if it runs through its capital. And if it's a large bank or one that is highly interconnected to other financial institutions, its failure can have devastating consequences for the financial system as a whole. The failure of one bank can transmit huge problems to other banks that it lends to or borrows from. They too can fail, and we can see an event like the 2008 financial crisis. And when you have such a financial crisis, it can cause enormous economic toll. We saw that when we hit near double-digit unemployment when the financial system collapsed. It hits hardworking Americans. It hits businesses that really had nothing to do with any of the activities that caused this.
Okay. So higher
it's
capital
important.
standards are about making the bank safer, but it's about making all of us safer, right? Basically,
Yes, because it diminishes the odds of a systemic financial
of a systemic failure. And that's
Yes.
why it's so important for these big banks. And look at what's happening today. Less than a year after 3 billionaire banks collapsed, another one, New York Community Bank, is now teetering. So we're just trying to make sure that these giant banks don't go broke and come back to the American taxpayer like they have done before to get a bailout. But the big banks like JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citi, and Wells Fargo are fighting back hard against these capital standards. They've spent millions of dollars lobbying. They're even running ads during the NFL playoffs. claiming that if they have to be a little bit safer, it will somehow raise grocery prices for American families. You know, in other words, they want us to believe that big banks are really worried about Americans' grocery bills. Nobody believes that. So the question is, what is this really about? The answer is profits. If giant banks have to hold back just a little more capital, that could bite into their buybacks and their executive compensation. In fact, Morgan Stanley recently said it out loud. The banking lobby is fighting to water down the capital rules so that these giant banks can create, quote, a significant increase in buybacks. Secretary Yellen, let me just ask, do you happen to know how much money the 4 biggest banks returned to their shareholders through stock buybacks and dividends over the last decade?
My guess is it's a large
It's a
amount, but
lot
I
of
don't
money.
know. I don't know the exact
I
figure.
actually looked this up, $630 billion. And do you know how much the average CEO pay at these big banks was in just 2022, just in that 1 year?
Yeah, I'm not sure. My guess would be around 30 million, but
It
I
was
don't know.
28 million. You're very, very close there. So higher capital requirements may mean fewer stock buybacks. It may mean somewhat smaller bonuses for the CEOs. These giant banks say that they will stop making mortgage loans if they have to hold a little more capital. But I got to say here, who can trust these guys? In 2020, Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan made big headlines when he pledged to make 40,000 mortgage loans to Black applicants. 40,000, that's a lot. More than 3 years later, how many loans have they actually made to Black applicants? 122. Yeah. So that's what this is all about. The biggest banks want to be able to push hundreds of millions of dollars out the door to investors and CEOs, while the banks take on more risks. And then when things go wrong, and they will go wrong, they want taxpayers to bail them out again. And they claim that if the Fed doesn't cave, people's groceries will cost more. You know, I am sick of bailouts, and I am sick of banks that lie to the American people. We need stronger capital rules to reduce the need for bailouts, and I urge our regulators to finalize these rules as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. There is, I believe Senator Fetterman is on the way and Senator Van Hollen's on the way. So I will just, in the meantime, I want to ask another question. We've had for decades, and I appreciate particularly your interchange with your exchange, I guess is the better word, with Senator Smith, pointing out the economy in this country versus other countries, pointing out the wage growth in this country. And you know, people were hit hard by inflation. People are for good reason are concerned. I think it's clear though that a big part of inflation has been all the corporate buybacks and corporate greed and just generally Wall Street predators. I cite often in this committee that the average, the CEO of Stellantis, the old Daimler Chrysler, which the UAW was on strike with or against, the CEO makes 365 times what the average worker makes. And that speaks volumes, I think. Senator Brett of Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Late last year, I asked various regulators who came before this committee whether they believed our banking system was strong or not. And they all answered yes. So today I would like to start with that same question for you. In your opinion, is the U.S. banking sector strong?
On balance, the answer is yes.
What are you balancing there?
Well, there are some risks, and there are some institutions that will face stresses from commercial real estate that we know was significantly impacted, particularly office buildings, by the pandemic. Interest rates are higher. Loans will have to be refinanced in an environment with higher interest charges, lower valuations, and rising vacancy rates. So, you know, for some banks, this will be a concern. But on balance, I'd say the system is well capitalized.
So one of the things that we've been looking at, and I want to talk about you leading the council. You're obviously the chair of FSOC and its efforts to monitor the risk and vulnerabilities within our financial system, of which you just named a few. I would certainly hope that part of this and part of what you're evaluating is the potential risk that regulations and rules, new rules coming out, the very own agencies that you oversee, what risk those may pose to our economy. I think these regulations could fundamentally weaken the banking sector. And so just want to talk to you about that. Are you assessing that and the implications of these new regulations or rules and what they will do to the American economy?
Well, I think you've raised a very valid issue, but FSOC's charge is to identify vulnerabilities in the financial system and threats that could lead to systemic financial consequences, and not to undertake an evaluation of the cost to the financial sector of actions that regulators have taken. So I don't think we're the right agency to be.
I do hope, though, that you're looking at the cumulative impact of all of these things. It seems that everything is moving so fast. We look at where our economy is right now, and I think that somebody needs to take a step back and take a look at how all of these things layer onto each other, what they do, and then what they do to the end user. This is about everyday Americans. This is about people all across the state of Alabama. And so I'm certainly hopeful that there is somebody that is taking a look in a broad way at all of these things and how they work or don't work, more importantly, together. Speaking of risk, I do want to discuss the U.S. sanctions policy. While I appreciate you being here today, I was frustrated that the Treasury Department did not appear before this committee following the October 7th atrocities that we saw occur across the globe. That was no doubt a day where we saw pure evil. And I want to talk to you specifically about our relationship with Iran. It's no secret that Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, providing hundreds of millions of dollars to support terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, as well as proxies in Syria and Iraq. They are actively carrying out other atrocities, including attacks on American civilians and service members. We know weakness invites aggression, and if we want peace, we have to do that through strengths. Terrorists are emboldened to target Americans and our allies. It seems that this administration, in the face of that, has doubled down on a strategy of appeasement. My question to you, Secretary Yellen, is after the October 7th attacks, the administration took actions to sanction a number of members of Hamas and operatives and financial facilitators, but obviously that was too little too late. How long had the administration known about the financiers of this terrorist attack prior to the actual date of October 7th?
Well, we have been focused on Hamas and other similar organizations and have been taking actions on sanctions before the attacks. We gained a lot more information in the aftermath of the attacks and have taken many more actions. And we've also been cracking down on Iran with respect to oil shipments, with respect to their petrochemical sector, with
Yes.
respect to steel.
And respectfully, my time is up. I would just say it's not working. We have to go back to a pressure of maximum strategy, because right now the Middle East is on fire. Iran is having its will, and we have 3 American service members dead. We've got to move in it.
We're very focused on it and
Senator Fetterman of
doing a
Pennsylvania is
great deal.
Senator Fetterman's recognized of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, I get to talk to one of the leading experts of the economy here. So now I want to talk about this here. Okay. So now President Biden has now brought down inflation, and now last month, over 350,000 new jobs, right?
Yes,
And the economy is growing at 3.3%, right?
yes.
Okay. Unemployment is now at 3.7%.
Correct?
That's pretty good, right?
And it's the longest stretch under
Yeah.
4% in 50 years.
Yeah. In fact, that was 36 months of job growth, right?
Yes,
Wow. And of course, rail wages are up too.
correct.
Yeah. And then now the Dow and the S&P 500 are now at record highs, right?
Yes,
Oh my gosh. So the Dow was over 38,600, 3,600. And the NASDAQ is almost 16,000. Right? That's those record highs. And is it fair to say that our economies and our economy and the recovery is really the envy of the world?
we're doing better than any other advanced country.
Yeah. So yeah, and actually, when I drove myself back to DC from Pittsburgh this week, I was able to gas up at under $3 a gallon. We're not talking about gas prices anymore. But now I want to now put that is like now some randoms on TikTok put up videos at McDonald's that they can rig a $16 extra meal. So what is really more reflective of our economy right now? Some kind of a TikTok about McDonald's, or with all those other kind of statistics that I've just been discussing over in this question?
Well, all the statistics you mentioned are highly relevant and by and large extremely positive. It is true that the level of some prices that are important to consumers have risen since the pandemic. One of those would be rents. Food prices are somewhat higher, new and used vehicles, but wages have also gone up. And now inflation has moderated very substantially. And in fact, by the measure that the Fed pays the most attention to, inflation over the last 6 months has been running at 2% at an annual rate. And wages are now going up substantially more rapidly
2%? 2%?
is the Fed's target.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
So prices are not rising rapidly anymore. Wages continue to. The number I tend to cite is that the median worker in the United States can buy the same typical basket of goods as in 2019 and have $1,400 left over to spend or save.
Yeah. And again, it's remarkable that now people want to talk about some random extra meal at McDonald's for $16, which really is a rigged situation. But now anybody, any fair experts would say that our economy is the envy of the world. And now what's lost in translation in our national conversation about where we are literally, in our economy versus now some of the other discussions in other parts of the media?
Well, I mean, we do see much more positive surveys of consumer sentiment in recent months since inflation has come under control and wages are rising more quickly. When Americans are polled and asked about a recent poll asking them about their own personal financial situation, more than 60% said they felt good, and more than 60% said they thought 2024 would be a better year. Now, sometimes when people are asked about the economy and how other people are doing, they seem more negative on it, but their own assessment of their own situation, as well as their behavior when it comes to spending or starting small businesses, we're seeing really record small business formation. And that's something that only really occurs when people feel confident about the future of the economy.
Thanks,
Well,
Senator Fetterman. Thank you.
Well, I did give her
Briefly.
a shout out, like great job, thank you. Anyway, so I'm out.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hagerty, if you'd like to also give her a shout out, I'll give you an extra 30 seconds.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. We'll see where we land with this. Welcome.
Or more important, if you'd like to give me a shout out, you'll get an extra minute.
I understand. Secretary Yellen, welcome back. Last week, the Treasury outlined its debt issuance plans for the upcoming quarter, and it included some unexpectedly optimistic net funding estimates. And so I have a few questions around that, if I might start there. First, can you explain the Treasury's elevated reliance on bill issuance, which obviously is more costly to the American taxpayer? It's certainly more costly than using notes or bonds right now. Is it because you've got concerns about demand for long-dated instruments, or is it more that you're trying to time where the Fed might go with its rate cuts?
We rely heavily on a regular and predictable schedule of auctions. And
I understand that. I'm talking about the mix of what you're.
we never try to time the market. We are in there for the long term. We want to make sure that there are not significant surprises for market participants. And so we have quarterly refunding schedules that are well considered and follow that principle. So
I understand, but shortening the duration of the curve, where you are on the curve right now, very short. What's the thought process behind that?
well, we're close to the proportion that has been recommended by the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee.
Does close to mean you're shorter or longer than the recommendation?
I believe we have a slightly higher short-term issuance, but
And indeed, let's come back to the optimistic funding estimates themselves. The estimates for this coming quarter, I thought they were just released last month, is unexpectedly high. I'm wondering what's driving this next quarter's increased estimate. Is it strong fiscal inflows that you're expecting, or is it merely tax receipts? Is it something structural that you see in the economy that's causing your projection to be higher for this coming quarter?
I can't give you, I need to come back to you with the details. I know we have actually lowered our estimate of the amount that we'll need to borrow in the first quarter. At our quarterly refunding, we indicated we expected to borrow $760 billion in the first quarter and a lesser amount in the second quarter. And actually, this estimate is lower than what we had expected.
No, it's more optimistic as a
October.
result. And I'm just trying to understand what you anticipate driving the inflows and why it's just this quarter, why it wouldn't manifest itself in the coming quarters, why those estimates happen.
Well, there are patterns that depend on when we get tax receipts. So as tax receipts come in April, there's less need.
So you're more optimistic the tax receipts will be higher than originally projected?
I'm not, I don't want to, I need to look into it, and I'd like to get back to you with the details.
Let's go to another area. You and I have talked about this before. It has to do with the politicization of what's happening at the Treasury. On multiple occasions, you and I have talked about it. Now there's an IRS contractor that has been actually sentenced for this, leaking confidential tax information belonging to the president, belonging to private citizens. The presiding judge appropriately referred to what happened as illegal, and he said, quote, "It was an intolerable attack on our constitutional democracy." And I think exploiting the IRS for political purposes is deeply concerning to every American. And in previous hearings, you've referred to this illegal act as very damaging. And I want you to just let me know if you still stand by that statement.
I do. I believe that protection of personal taxpayer information is utterly essential.
Yeah,
and we're devoted to it. And I know that, although I can't give you the details.
I agree with you on that. I just want to point out one thing that deeply concerns me, because even more damage continues to be inflicted on the credibility of the Treasury. If you think about last month's revelation that FinCEN, that's a bureau that's under your watch, directed financial institutions to flag customers who demonstrated, quote, extremist indicators, like the words Trump or MAGA, or whether they made transactions to purchase religious books. This time it's not just an IRS contractor doing it. This is the administration itself taking personal data to target its political foes. Secretary Yellen, do you believe that people that purchase Bibles are extremists?
Certainly not. I want to put this matter in perspective. First of all, FinCEN's mission is to safeguard the financial system from illicit use, to combat money laundering, terrorist finance.
Certainly not to
And
target Americans for purchasing Bibles or voting for Donald Trump.
FinCEN is expected to work closely with law enforcement and financial institutions on their money laundering detection programs. And so there are interchanges and conversations between FinCEN and financial institutions. And I believe that the matter that you are referring to dates back to before my time as Treasury Secretary and in the aftermath of the January 6th attack on the Capitol. So starting in the Trump administration, there were efforts to work with financial institutions to determine what had happened and to work with them to provide relevant information.
And purchasing a Bible is relevant information to determine that these people are
I-
extremists. It's
I-
ridiculous.
I
It's a
will
shame.
I will get back to you with more detailed information when I've had a chance to study this thoroughly.
Please
I
do.
want
Senator
you to
Van-
understand that this dates back, these were conversations between, I believe, staff at FinCEN and financial institutions that is the purpose of FinCEN. And so the details, I promise to thoroughly investigate.
Thank you,
and
Senator.
get back
Thank
to
you. Thank you,
This
Senator.
bureaucracy is under your charge.
There are a number of
Please take it.
things happened between January 1st and January 20th of 2021. Senator Van Hollen's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Madam Secretary. Thanks for all the work that you are doing. And I do want to talk a little about the economy and just ask you to reflect on where nonpartisan groups like the Congressional Budget Office predicted we would be in terms of unemployment today, back around the time the president was sworn in, when the pandemic was really in full swing, the economy was hurting, and before we passed the American Rescue Plan.
I must admit, I can't remember the precise numbers, but the impact of the pandemic was expected to be very severe and to last a very long time. And the U.S. economy has done an order of magnitude better than would have been expected by CBO or other forecasters back then. And I do believe that Biden administration policies have played a very important role for that good performance.
Well, it's exceeded all expectations. And as you said earlier in your testimony, certainly surpassed any of our other partner economies
Yes.
around the world. I would like to talk a little bit about the price issue. And you mentioned the supply chain issues, creating bottlenecks that led to price increases around
Yes.
the time of the pandemic. There's another factor at work, I believe, when it comes to high food prices now. And I think the president has spoken to this somewhat, which is the price gouging, in the sense that the profit margins of some of the big grocery manufacturers today exceed their profit margins before the pandemic. Is that an accurate statement?
I believe it is. I believe the Council of Economic Advisors has looked at this. I haven't personally reviewed that data, but I think that is true.
Which is one of the reasons the president's been so focused on going after price gouging in all its forms and junk fees. And I know the Treasury plays some role in that. Is that something you and your team are working on?
Well, we participate in economic discussions and policy making.
With the CD, absolutely. Well, thank you for the role that you are playing. If I could just ask you about investor advisor reporting requirements, because You're often before the appropriations subcommittee that I chair, the FISG subcommittee, and we've had this ongoing conversation about the fact that you've got Russian oligarchs and other kleptocrats who have used investment advisors, including private equity and venture capital and hedge fund managers, to attempt to clean their ill-gotten gains. Now, you mentioned already the fact that we had the beneficial ownership law. I understand that just yesterday you've included some folks within the real estate area. But can you talk about progress you're making in this broader area of investment advisors? Because it is important that we try to close one door, but it doesn't do us any good if it leaves the back door wide open.
Well, investment advisors is a financial sector that hasn't been uniformly covered by AML-CFT requirements. There are some investment advisors who are brokers or may be covered by some rules, but there are certainly investment advisors that are not covered. And our risk assessments show that that is an area that provides an avenue for sanctioned individuals, for criminals and the like, to move wealth and invest in the United States without the sources of their wealth being detected. And
So are we making progress in terms of developing a rule to close
yes,
this
yes,
loophole?
yes, we are. Absolutely. We expect to issue such a proposed rule soon.
Good. In my remaining time, I just wanted to ask you about the outbound investment proposals the Biden administration has put forward to try to prevent very capital from the United States helping to invest in China's military. This is obviously an effort that requires cooperation from our allies around the world. Can you just provide an update on where that effort stands?
So in response to an executive order, Treasury prepared a notice of proposed rulemaking, which it issued that asks a series of questions and proposes both information gathering and some restrictions, indicates it's contemplating restrictions in the areas of artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and quantum computing, areas that seem to have a clear nexus to national security risks. And we've received comments and hope to come out with a notice of proposed rulemaking that takes account of the comments and closes down channels. I mean, we have export controls and other controls, but these outbound investments can be a way of providing aid to China's military or other countries of concern that need to be closed down.
I appreciate that and just want to make sure we're also coordinating with our allies because again, it's important that we do this in coordination. I think you would agree.
Yes, we are. We have worked very closely with our allies and are urging them to adopt similar regulations.
Thank you, Madam
Thanks.
Secretary.
Senator Vance from Ohio is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Yellen, thanks for being here. I actually wanted to ask about something that's probably pretty far afield and you've stopped thinking about, but we haven't got a chance to talk about, and that's the SVB collapse and sort of the run up to the acquisition of SVB by JP Morgan. Yeah, I want to sort of start just with a kind of a basic question. So to recap, the systemic risk exception was triggered for the SVB situation, which was clearly pretty dire, pretty significant. Because of the systemic risk exception was triggered, the FDIC effectively engaged in what I would call a bailout of the uninsured depositors, but whatever term you want to apply to it, the uninsured depositors were made whole. Obviously, the shareholders were not. But the argument, of course, is that that somehow prevented a broader panic or bank run in the markets. And I'm curious, Secretary Yellen, if you could just take me back to that decision coming up on a year ago. Why did you think, given that SVB was so focused on obviously the technology sector, the venture capital sector, a sector I know well, why did you think that it posed a systemic risk to the economy, or why did you and the broader board decide that?
Well, we were concerned about contagion to other banks. And the source of the problem, I mean, there were really two things that affected Silicon Valley Bank. One was losses, mainly unrealized, but nevertheless obvious losses from a failure to manage interest rate risk properly. So interest rates had risen substantially. This firm had purchased longer-term assets, the value of which fell in a higher interest rate environment. And that was a risk that affected many banks in the United States. So that risk was not in any way confined just to Silicon Valley Bank. Many banks suffered similar losses. The other issue is that Silicon Valley Bank relied very, very heavily on uninsured deposits. And now we saw a pace of runs that was beyond anything.
Understood.
But other banks also, we actually have quite a high level of uninsured deposits in the banking system. And many Americans may have felt if depositors, uninsured depositors at SVB were haircut or their funds were immobilized in a resolution, that the same thing could happen to them at other banks.
Understood. So just one follow-up question to that, and if I have time, I'll ask about the CFIUS review of Nippon Steel acquiring U.S. Steel. But just quickly on this, if you could. So my understanding is that there were multiple bids when the SVB collapsed. There were multiple bids that were on the table for acquiring SVB and sort of its assets. At the time, the public reporting suggested that the difference between the JP Morgan bid and the next best bid was $20 billion.
I believe that you talking about First Republic that went to JP Morgan Chase?
I'm talking about SVB. Didn't SVB go to JP Morgan? Sorry, First Republic. You're right. My understanding from based on the public reporting is that there was a $20 billion difference between the best bid, JP Morgan's, and the second best bid for First Republic. Some of the follow-on reporting and some of the private conversations I've had and my staff has had suggest that the difference was about $1 billion. So two-part question. Number one, what was the difference?
So in terms of the bids, I didn't see those bids. There's a question for Marty Grunberg, who's head of the FDIC. But I will say under the law, the FDIC is required to accept the highest bid that reduces FDIC losses as much as possible. On the details of what the bids were, you'll have to consult with him.
So I guess the worry is, I'm very worried about the three-tiered banking system in our country. You want small, medium, and large banks. Obviously, we have the GSIBs, but I also want a healthy banking sector below the GSIBs. And my concern here is that we actually didn't care enough about concentration and how that transaction manifested itself. And I guess the simple question is that because you didn't have the tools to analyze that transaction with concerns about concentration, or is that because you had the tools and just didn't use them?
So let me first say, I share your concern and believe it's important to have a diverse banking system. I believe there were a number of bids by different banks for SVB and for First Republic. And as I said, I believe under the law, the FDIC is required to accept the bid that results in the smallest losses to the Deposit Insurance Fund.
Understood. Thanks.
Thanks, Senator Vance. Warnock of Georgia is recognized.
Thank you so very much, Chair Brown. It's been 14 years since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, yet 10 states, including Georgia, have not fully expanded Medicaid. Let me be clear, closing the health care gap is the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. It's good for our economy. In fact, a recent report from the Council of Economic Advisors concluded that Medicaid expansion increases the disposable income of those gaining health coverage. And for those who are listening and watching, I want to be clear that when we say expansion, we're not talking about a new program. We're not talking about spending additional dollars. We're talking about the fact that citizens in states like Georgia don't have access, that they're subsidizing healthcare in other states while their hospitals are closing. But the Council of Economic Advisors pulls into sharp focus the importance of this, the ways in which we can allow hardworking families to spend less on healthcare and more on essentials like food, diapers, and school supplies. Secretary Yellen, thank you so much for being here. Can you discuss how state economies have improved post-expansion, specifically compared to non-expansion states like Georgia?
You're talking about in terms of uninsured, uninsured individuals?
Yeah, how
or-
the states that have expanded Medicaid, how that expansion has improved the economies of those states juxtaposed with states that are non-expansion states.
I honestly can't give you numerical assessments of that. I haven't done that, but generally states that have expanded Medicaid have done better, and certainly the households in those states, and especially lower income households, have been relieved of burdens that allow them to spend more to support themselves and the economies of those states.
Here's what we do know about closing Medicaid coverage gap in Georgia. If we were to close that Medicaid coverage gap in Georgia, it would mean $1.2 billion in additional federal support that I secured through the American Rescue Plan Act. That money sitting on the table, 600,000 Georgians in the Medicaid gap. It would mean 56,000 new jobs every year, with 12,000 of those in rural communities. And it would mean $6.5 billion per year generated in economic output. And so I'm hopeful, I remain hopeful that Georgia lawmakers will do the right thing for Georgians and close the healthcare coverage gap. I want to move on to another topic, the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, which I helped pass through the American Rescue Plan, was transformational for millions of Americans, reducing the number of kids living in poverty by more than 40%. All in all, these provisions collectively lifted nearly 10 million children above the poverty line or just slightly below the poverty line. These funds help Georgians buy essentials like food, diapers, a coat for their kid, life-saving prescription drugs. But unfortunately, these provisions expired and we lost the dramatic gains we made in combating childhood poverty. The 2023 FSOC annual report noted that while consumer financial health remains positive, we are seeing recent indicators of falling savings and rising credit card and auto loan delinquencies. Secretary Yellen, the child tax credit was a tax cut that put money in families' pockets. What economic benefits do we see from policies like this that focused on reducing childhood poverty, including on families' ability to save?
Well, I think it had an utterly dramatic effect on households. And as you mentioned, it resulted in a massive reduction in child poverty. It fell in 2021 to, I believe, 5.2%, which is the lowest on record. And of course, it means that families had, many still struggling because of the pandemic, had the resources to support their children. make sure that they weren't deprived of the food and other support that they need to go on to lead good lives and be productive members of the workforce as they get older. And, you know, many of these payments went to families that were in dire need. It's a tremendously important support.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very much in favor of tax cuts for working families. And this is why we've got to restore the child tax credit. And this is why the enhanced child tax credit found within the Bipartisan Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act is an important first step. And I hope we can get that legislation passed soon. Thank you so much for your
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Warnock, and thank you for soon after you came here in 2001, we passed the most important attack on child poverty in decades, and thank you for your leadership role in it. Secretary Yellen, thank you. I know that this committee hearing and the preparation time for a hearing like this takes a huge chunk out of maybe the most complicated job in the federal government, certainly one of the most complicated. Every week, it seems, we learn about another responsibility that the Treasury Department has. So thank you. And thank you in light of what Senator Warnock said. I remember, and I still talk about the call I had with you after the president signed the American Recovery Act. And we passed it on March 6th. He signed it within a couple of weeks. Our conversation, you immediately brought in Commissioner Reddick, who was a Trump appointee, but who was reasonable and professional. And we got that moving. And by July, checks went out to the families of 60 million children, 2 million of them in my state. It changed the lives of so many, and it would change the lives dramatically if we could renew it as we're trying to do in a tax bill now. But thank you. For senators who wish to submit questions, those questions are due 1 week from today, the 15th of February. Then you will have 45 days, you and your staff, to respond to any questions. Thank you so much for your public service.
Sí, bueno, pues la novedad es muy relevante, es muy relevante. ¿Por qué? Porque los productos de inversión alternativos es un complemento perfecto en las carteras de los clientes, ¿no? Porque tienen menos correlación con los mercados bursátiles y con las oscilaciones del mercado, y a largo plazo ofrecen una rentabilidad más atractiva a los clientes en general, especialmente en los entornos en los que nos movíamos hace unos años de tipos bajos de interés, ¿no? De tal manera que, bueno, estos productos permitían que las rentabilidades de los clientes fueran mejores. ¿Cuál era el problema? Que en España, para invertir en producto alternativo, la inversión mínima del cliente minorista o retail era 100.000 euros. Es bastante dinero. ¿Cuál ha sido la reforma? Que se permite, a partir de, bueno, pues de una modificación de la norma de capital riesgo y recientemente también en lo relativo a hedge funds, que el cliente minorista pueda invertir en este tipo de productos siempre que su inversión obedezca a una recomendación personalizada de un intermediario financiero. Ese es el primer requisito. El segundo requisito es que si la cartera de instrumentos financieros del cliente es inferior a 500.000 euros, el máximo de la inversión puede alcanzar el 10% de esos 500.000 euros, o sea, 50.000 euros. Y el mínimo 10.000. En resumen, lo que ocurre es que pasa a ser un producto accesible para, bueno, pues el inversor medio, ¿no?
José María, no tengo mucho tiempo, nos quedan como un minutito más aproximadamente. Te tengo que preguntar también retos para el sector y para la empresa en concreto.
Bueno, yo creo que para el sector es un sector, bueno, pues diría en consolidación en España. Hay nueva normativa que va a tener que hacer frente, siempre, pues bueno, pues está por detrás pues el tema de los incentivos, en qué escenarios se van a poder cobrar incentivos, la nueva Retail Investment Strategy que ha propuesto la Unión Europea, que está en fase de borrador, que eso pues va va a poner en tela de juicio, pues oye, si los productos en términos de precio y beneficios están bien definidos, etcétera. El sector afronta grandes retos. A nivel de FinReg y nuestro modelo de asesoramiento, pues muchas oportunidades, ¿no? Porque al final, bueno, pues estamos desde asesorando a gestoras, asesorando a proveedores de servicios sobre criptoactivos, bancos, aseguradoras, y la verdad es que, bueno, el reto es seguir acompañando a nuestros clientes, igual que hemos hecho estos 7 años, en, bueno, pues ir cumpliendo y acomodando sus modelos de negocio a la nueva normativa, ¿no? Yo creo que
Pues,
trabajo no nos falta.
José María Olivares, socio de FinReg 360, muchísimas gracias por venir aquí a nuestros estudios y que os vaya muy bien.
Muchas gracias, Marta. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, nosotros creo que ya podemos saludar también hoy, hablando de mercados, a Alberto Iturralde, responsable de operativa DAX. Alberto, muy buenas tardes.
Muy buenas tardes.
Bueno, Alberto, hoy el mercado, el S&P 500 concretamente, fijándose en los 5.000, parece que todavía no ha conseguido alcanzarlos en todo el día. No sé si lo conseguiremos. En cualquier caso, es un nivel simbólico y entiendo que a nivel técnico tampoco tiene demasiada importancia porque seguirían siendo máximos históricos. Pero cuéntanos tú también un poco cómo estás viendo este movimiento, este número, esta cifra de 5.000 puntos y cómo estás viendo cómo se están moviendo los índices americanos.
Tienes razón en todo lo que has dicho. Es un nivel simbólico, no es un soporte ni una resistencia técnica necesariamente, porque el S&P 500 estaría marcando nuevos máximos. Sin embargo, tiene mucha importancia. Cuando el sistema financiero quiere realizar una acción, necesita un catalizador. Por ejemplo, si los bancos de inversión quisieran vender títulos de una manera más masiva de lo habitual, necesitarían que los pequeños inversores acudieran a la bolsa, en tropel a poder ser, para llevar a cabo ventas sin que los títulos desciendan mucho en su precio por las ventas de esos bancos de inversión dentro del sistema financiero. ¿Y cuál es uno de los catalizadores más habituales? Pues uno de los catalizadores más habituales es el nivel psicológico de los, pongamos en este caso, 5.000. Como lo será si algún día el S&P 500 llega a 10.000. Es decir, que cuando se produce ese tipo de situaciones debemos tener mucho cuidado porque quizás el índice S&P 500 llega a marcar y a cerrar por encima de 5.000 y al día siguiente nos encontramos con todos los periódicos diciéndonos que ¡guau!, el S&P 500 supera 5.000. Eso lleva a comprar al mercado a muchas personas que estaban mirando los toros desde la barrera. Hay un problema añadido, porque el profesional de bolsa podría pensar, bueno, es que el futuro del S&P 500 ya ha superado los 5.000. Fijaos, aquí tenéis el gráfico, está ahora mismo en 5.010 y de hecho ayer cerraba por encima de 5.000. Sin embargo, el futuro no es una referencia para el inversor habitual. El futuro es una referencia muy profesionalizada. El S&P 500 índice sí lo es. Así es que cuidado. Si cuando el S&P 500 cierre por encima de 5.000, que es muy probable, ayer marcaba 4.999,89. Si miramos ese gráfico, está justo donde pone la flecha, está justo ahí a unas milésimas de llegar. Bueno, pues si cierra por encima y al día siguiente hay esos rotativos, el S&P 500 en máximos históricos supera los 5.000, cuidado, porque va a ser una excusa para que entre todo el mundo a comprar y tendremos que preguntarnos quién está vendiendo. Así es que mucho cuidado.
Quería también enfocarme en las compañías bancarias, las entidades bancarias, porque hoy ha hablado Janet Yellen, no sé si has podido escuchar alguna cosilla, pero ha hablado, por ejemplo, de la crisis inmobiliaria comercial, dice que no piensa que pueda generar un riesgo sistémico bancario y es verdad que a medida que hablaba Yellen se iban moviendo los títulos bancarios que han caído mucho estos días, por ejemplo, New York Community Bank Corp, y no sé si puedes mirarlo, pero estaría interesante también comentar ese gráfico, sobre todo en el movimiento de hoy, porque ha empezado cayendo casi un 7, luego se ha dado la vuelta totalmente y estaba incluso subiendo y ahora otra vez cayendo casi un 5%. La volatilidad está asegurada en este sector. Alberto, yo no sé también cómo estás viendo tú todos estos movimientos que están ocurriendo en el sector bancario estadounidense. Ahora comentamos también el sector europeo, sobre todo Alemania, después del anuncio de ayer de uno de esos bancos, pero primero Estados Unidos.
Si esta conversación la hubiéramos mantenido hace 11 meses, en marzo, cuando se producía esa crisis de los bancos californianos, estaríamos haciéndolo en otro tono, mucho más tremendista y mucho más salido probablemente de la realidad bursátil. ¿Por qué? Las crisis en los bancos medianos y pequeños son imprescindibles para la inmensa banca. Hablo de los JP Morgan. Son imprescindibles. Es la manera que tienen, y lo explicábamos en marzo del año pasado, de ir devorando poco a poco cuota de mercado de un golpe. La diferencia es si estas crisis puntuales, en este caso del New York Community Bancorp, suponen un riesgo realmente sistémico. Por ejemplo, citas el caso de Alemania y un banco que no es el Deutsche Bank, pero vamos a ver si consigo el Deutsche Bank y miramos cómo puede estar afectando a ese banco lo que está sucediendo en Alemania. A ver si aparece, me parece que me va a costar encontrarlo. Vamos a ver, un momentito. Vamos a ver, no lo consigo encontrar con facilidad. El Deutsche Bank y la banca Alemania llevan mucho tiempo con problemas. Aquí está. Y es probable que durante las próximas semanas, viendo, de hecho, fijaos, lo que ha sucedido en las últimas sesiones, el Deutsche Bank está cayendo con mucha fuerza. En España el BBV está marcando nuevos máximos históricos. Bueno, pues es normal que esos bancos que tienen una trayectoria bajista, digo Deutsche Bank concretamente, desde hace muchos años, pues tenga un comportamiento peor que los demás. Pero eso no supone ningún riesgo sistémico. Es decir, supone que obviamente dentro del mundo de la deuda desenfrenada en el que vivimos, va a haber muchos bancos que sufran. Tiene que ver con que si Powell en su día, durante el año 21, te decía que la inflación era un fenómeno temporal y que no iban a subir los tipos de interés y todo el mundo se lo cree, pues no pasa nada. Los bancos adoptan decisiones a X años vista, luego suben los tipos de interés a una velocidad brutal y se nos rompen los remaches. Bueno, pues simplemente es que somos tontos si hacemos caso a lo que dice Powell. Pero nada nuevo bajo el sol. Nada que un banco normal, como un Santander y un BBV, que en España son oligarquía y hacen y quitan leyes, le vaya a afectar. Nada que a esos bancos les vaya a afectar. Con lo cual, sí, es muy interesante en el plano informativo lo que está pasando allí, pero son bancos residuales. Imagínate, cuando pasaba Credit Suisse es un nombre súper conocido, o lo era, cada vez menos. Bueno, pero Credit Suisse, su gráfico ya te decía que tenía problemas. Tú miras el gráfico de Citi y lo mismo. Es que un día imagínate que Citi tiene problemas. Pues sí, tiene problemas. Su gráfico lo decía. Son cosas que son esperables y no son sistémicas.
Alberto, citabas también el caso de Alemania y quería preguntarte más en concreto sobre ello, porque has hablado de Deutsche Bank y ayer otro de los bancos alemanes avisaba de que tenía que aumentar provisiones por lo que estaba pasando en el inmobiliario comercial estadounidense. De hecho, decía que se avecina la mayor crisis inmobiliaria desde la crisis financiera de 2008, que esto ya es raro, ¿no? Que haya un banco que salga a hacer una afirmación de esta importancia, porque es verdad que hemos visto que otros bancos dicen, no, citan la debilidad del sector inmobiliario comercial, pero nunca nadie ha sido tan concreto. El banco creo que el ticker es PBB, si no recuerdo mal es Deutsche Pfandbriefbank, que cuesta pronunciarlo, pero así es, por eso más fácilmente hablamos de PBB. Y es verdad que ayer también caía bastante. Voy a echar un vistazo también a cómo está cotizando ahora mismo. Me parece que la caída es del 2% aproximadamente. ¿Qué opinión te merece también lo que está pasando en la banca alemana específicamente?
El mejor ejemplo, el gráfico de este valor. Si lo podéis pinchar, se va a ver. Mirad, este banco que cotiza, por lo menos en el gráfico desde el año 2015, tiene en el año 2020 unos máximos históricos. Cuando el murciélago fue comido por un pangolín, el valor descendió una barbaridad. Claro, alguien podría decir, bueno, todo descendió, sí, pero posteriormente no volvió a recuperar esos máximos previos a la crisis de 2020. Y ahora mismo está en zona de mínimos y rompiéndolos de los mínimos que marcaba en 2020, con una verticalidad enorme. El gráfico siempre nos dice lo que hay detrás de una compañía, porque el propio núcleo duro de la compañía sabe que en su gestión hay un fallo, han tomado decisiones equivocadas y las cosas van mal. Son los primeros que hablan con el núcleo duro y el núcleo duro tiende a vender títulos, lo cual hace que el precio cada vez funcione peor. Pero es que si alguien en un momento determinado quisiera traernos este ejemplo como algo sistémico, pues yo le contrapongo el gráfico del BBV, mirad el gráfico del BBV. La caída de 2020 se produce justo en una zona 2 euros cuando actualmente el BBV desde entonces ha llegado a subir y está hoy en nuevos máximos históricos un 328%. Es decir, que no es nunca equiparable la situación que hemos comentado al respecto de ese banco alemán con cualquier otro banco, por ejemplo, español. Y sí, evidencian que tienen problemas, pero su gráfico ya lo adelanta mucho antes de nosotros tener la evidencia. Cada vez que pensemos si esto es sistémico, solo tenemos que acudir al gráfico. En casos que hemos conocido en España, Banco Popular, el gráfico era muchísimo más bajista comparado con los demás. Ya te decían que había algo malo ahí. Sin embargo, la cúpula directiva te decía Saracho y previamente Ángel Ron, no, todo está fantástico, un banco ejemplar. ¿Por qué cae tanto? Bueno, pues aquí pasa lo mismo. Es decir, claro que tiene problemas este banco. Los lleva teniendo desde 2020.
Muy explicativo y muy didáctico. Responsable de operativa DAX. Gracias, Alberto.
Gracias, fuerte abrazo.
Bueno, y por cierto, nosotros ya nos encaminamos al cierre del mercado europeo, que en estos momentos se avecina ser un cierre en positivo para algunos índices. 0,2% de subida de momento para el IBEX 35, Eurostoxx 50, 0,6%, CAC 40, 0,6%. Hacemos una pausa y enseguida lo comentamos más en profundidad.
Ya sé que los premios no lo son todo, pero cuando veo un espacio lleno de ellos, impresiona. A menudo los premios dicen mucho de una persona. Pasión, compromiso. Siempre que no sea un trofeo cualquiera que algunos exhiben en su despacho. Es difícil encontrar un broker que cumpla con todas sus expectativas. O quizá no tanto. Active Trades, broker online desde 2001.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas. Si estás viendo esta cadena es que te gusta estar bien informado y te gustan mucho los mercados financieros. Y lo más importante de todo, te gusta sacarle dinero al mercado. Así que tenemos una cita, el cierre de Wall Street los lunes a las 9:30 de la noche, los martes y los jueves un poquito antes, a las 9:15. Aquí estaremos en Negocios Televisión explicando, consultorio, explicando por qué tomo decisiones de compra, por qué vendo, todo lo relacionado con los mercados. Ese consultorio a vuestra disposición para ver cómo veo el mercado y un montón de novedades que iremos anunciando próximamente.
Bueno, pues seguimos muy pendientes de lo que está pasando en los mercados financieros, mercados que ahora están ya echando el cierre en el viejo continente. Y vemos ahora mismo repuntes del 0,2% para el IBEX 35 hasta los 9.908 puntos. CAC 40 de París, que acaba la sesión con un 0,6% arriba, el Eurostoxx 50, 0,6%, también el DAX alemán 0,2% de subida. Y recuerden, hoy sobre todo mucha atención puesta en la banca, también sobre todo la alemana, en este caso el Deutsche Pfandbriefbank hoy cierra la sesión con una caída del 0,5%, ha llegado a ser una caída mucho mayor, estaba cotizando en los 4,47 euros la acción, ahora cierra con 4,64 euros la acción concretamente, con ese 0,5% de retroceso. Y también muy pendientes, por cierto, de Talgo en España, cotizando en el mercado continuo, que, bueno, parece que ha acabado la sesión suspendida de cotización, todavía a la espera de que haya más información al respecto, perdón, de esa posible OPA realizada por parte del ex asesor de Víctor Orbán sobre la compañía. Estamos a la espera de que se publique una información relevante al respecto. Parece que han esperado al cierre del mercado. Así que vamos a ver si en estos próximos minutos tenemos alguna información privilegiada publicada en la CNMV. Por el momento también repasar los últimos movimientos de otros activos. Miramos al petróleo, en este caso, que ahora mismo lo tenemos subiendo un 2,6% en el caso del West Texas, 2,5% de subida para el Brent, 81,20 dólares, supera ya los 80 dólares el barril, subidas importantísimas para el crudo, y mientras tanto en el euro dólar, retrocesos del 0,10% hasta los 1,0763 dólares el euro. Con esto terminamos ese cierre del mercado europeo.
Admirals invierte sin comisiones en más de 4.000 activos.
Bueno, pues seguimos muy pendientes de lo que está pasando con respecto a Talgo, esa compañía que podría ser, sujeto de ese lanzamiento de una OPA por parte del ex asesor de Víctor Orbán, y hoy pendientes también en España, por ejemplo, de otros nombres que han sido protagonistas. Es el caso de ArcelorMittal, que ya saben que cotiza en el IBEX 35, que ha cerrado el ejercicio 2023 con un beneficio neto atribuido de 919 millones de dólares. Eso supone una caída del 90% respecto del resultado contabilizado en 2022. Bueno, las ventas de esta empresa en el conjunto del año 2023 han sumado 68.275 millones de dólares, y esto es un 14,5% menos que el año anterior. Pendientes también, disculpen, de empresas como Maersk, que hoy han cerrado la sesión con un 16% de caída, que se dice pronto, compañía que hoy ha advertido también de las pérdidas que ha sufrido en el cuarto trimestre, pérdidas operativas, advirtiendo también que va a terminar este año con pérdidas, incluso con la perturbación actual en el Mar Rojo, y ha asegurado y ha culpado también a los importantes desafíos de exceso de oferta, ya que los barcos pedidos durante los últimos años de auge se entregan en tiempos difíciles, dice. Bueno, y con esto me parece que ya podemos pasar al análisis del cierre de sesión en Europa. Saludamos a Adrián Ostaledo, analista de XTV. Adrián, muy buenas tardes. Bueno, Adrián, cierre europeo en positivo en el día de hoy, subidas para los principales índices. Voy a echar un vistazo al IBEX 35, cierra con un 0,17%, 9.905 puntos. Es verdad que hoy parece que la noticia no está tanto en el movimiento de los índices, aquí no hay mucha chicha, está más bien en algunos títulos concretos. Pero, ¿cómo habéis visto en general el día de hoy?
Bueno, hemos visto un día, como tú bien dices, que ya a primera hora por la mañana veíamos que el calendario macro iba a ser muy ligero. Habíamos tenido datos de inflación en China, que es verdad que han sido una sorpresa, pero después la continuación en Europa y en Estados Unidos, pues eso, era un calendario macro que no nos iba a dar grandes noticias y que habría que ir a buscarlas al panorama corporativo. Y así ha sido. Han rondado más, ¿no? Los titulares en cuanto a noticias, en cuanto a empresas como Talgo, que en cuanto a los grandes movimientos de los índices, que ni en Europa ni en Estados Unidos podemos hablar de subidas destacadas, y no parece que hoy se vaya a romper ningún soporte ni ninguna resistencia.
Y en España, sobre todo, mucha atención sobre Talgo, ¿no? Porque hay, en este caso, el ex asesor de Víctor Orbán, que habría lanzado o intentado lanzar una OPA sobre la compañía. De momento eso es lo que se está especulando. Falta todavía la confirmación de la propia empresa. Se espera que enseguida tengamos ya una información privilegiada publicada en la CNMV. De momento no hay nada, porque lo estoy revisando, y ha cerrado la sesión suspendida de cotización, con una subida, por cierto, el último movimiento era un repunte del 9%. ¿Qué opináis de esta posible OPA sobre la empresa, sobre Talgo?
Va a haber que esperar, porque no sería la primera vez que surgen rumores de una OPA en empresas españolas que finalmente queda en nada. En los últimos años quizás hemos visto que hay menos empresas opables de lo que pensábamos, o que por muchos rumores que haya luego no se ha llevado a cabo. Me acuerdo que le pasó a Colonial hace un par de años y finalmente no fue opada. En este caso parece que la diana está puesta en Talgo, que es verdad que suscita interés en los mercados. No solo le pasa a esta empresa húngara, a BJJ, parece que también tiene el interés de fabricantes suizos Alder, de incluso CAF, con la que podría generar muchas sinergias porque ya tiene muchos negocios actualmente. Veremos. No deja de ser una empresa con una capitalización bursátil que ronda los 500 millones. O sea, no es ni mucho menos de las más grandes de España, pero precisamente esto puede hacerla más atractiva y que en las próximas horas tengamos noticias, confirmaciones por parte de la CNMV de que a lo mejor sí que va para adelante esta vez y la vemos suspendida de cotización algo más tiempo antes de que de verdad le veamos con esa posible subida de doble dígito, con el entusiasmo que podría generar en los mercados una OPA de este nivel.
Quería preguntarte también por Maersk, compañía que también hoy ha hablado de cifras, de números, que espera también tener pérdidas en el conjunto del ejercicio por lo que está sucediendo también en la crisis del Mar Rojo. La compañía hoy ha caído más de un 15% al cierre de sesión, que se dice pronto también.
Sí, hemos conocido sus resultados y también las previsiones que nos ha ofrecido para 2024 han sido claramente pesimistas. Han preferido hacer una orientación a la baja, han echado la culpa al aumento de los fletes, que en esto tienen razón, un aumento de los fletes por el transporte marítimo, en el transporte marítimo, especialmente debido a la crisis que tenemos en el Mar Rojo y como digo, pues esperan caídas en casi todas sus partidas, en casi todo el desglose contable de cara al 2024 y esto pues el mercado al final lo ha recogido con el precio.
Adriano Sales desde XTV, muchísimas gracias como siempre. Pasa buena tarde.
A vosotros, un saludo.
Y nosotros a esta hora, como siempre, repasamos la noticia ESG del día con Nordea Asset Management.
Nordea Asset Management le ofrece la noticia ESG del día.
Hablamos de la energía eólica, que ha producido más energía eléctrica que el gas por primera vez en la Unión Europea y lo ha hecho en el año 2023 según un estudio publicado por el laboratorio de ideas británico Ember. De acuerdo con el análisis de electricidad europea, la electricidad generada con el viento ha sido del 18% frente al 17% obtenida mediante gas, en un año en el que las renovables continúan su crecimiento hasta suponer el 44% de la energía eléctrica anual. Además, ha expuesto una caída sin precedentes en el uso del gas y el carbón para la producción de electricidad en la Unión Europea, lo que ha conllevado una reducción récord en las emisiones de dióxido de carbono del sector de un 19%. Bruselas, por cierto, anticipa otros 1.400 millones a España para aplicar su plan de descarbonización de la economía.
Nordea Asset Management le ha ofrecido la noticia ESG del día.
Pues cierre negativo en positivo para el grueso de los índices europeos, no en negativo ahora sí el S&P 500 que todavía sigue abierto, ya lo saben, hasta el cierre de Wall Street y de momento está con caídas, parece que los 5.000 se están resistiendo un poquito, ayer nos acercábamos peligrosamente, estábamos ahí casi rozándolo con los dedos, pero no se llegaron a conseguir. Nivel simbólico, aún así, de todas maneras, les diré, 0,09% de caída ahora mismo para el S&P, 4.990 puntos. Hacemos una pausa y enseguida estamos de vuelta hablando del mercado y de las salidas a cotización.
¿Las soluciones de inversión tradicionales ya no cumplen con sus objetivos financieros? ¿La escasa rentabilidad y la volatilidad de los mercados le empujan a mantener los ahorros en su cuenta corriente? Si la respuesta a ambas preguntas es afirmativa, lo más probable es que esté pensando que la opción de no invertir es la óptima. Esta alternativa es quizás la más inmediata, pero ciertamente no parece la más rentable. Nuestros productos de generación de rentas están diseñados para ofrecerle el equilibrio adecuado entre seguridad y rentabilidad, con el fin de aprovechar todas las oportunidades del mercado. Hemos revisado nuestro enfoque tradicional, ampliando el espectro de oportunidades dentro del segmento de rentas para una inversión que le prepare mejor para el futuro. Y con la integración de los principios ESG, podemos ayudar a construir un futuro más verde para todos los inversores que buscan rentabilidad. No se conforme con la liquidez. Prepárese para el futuro con fondos de Invesco. Descubra más en invesco.es/income.
Localizarnos ahora es más fácil. La economía a tu alcance. Empresas, inversiones, tecnología. Ya en la app de Movistar. Vive la economía. Negocios Televisión.
Pues ya estamos de vuelta, a la espera también de que salga alguna información importante en la CNMV sobre Talgo y esa posible OPA que realizaría el exasesor de Víctor Orbán, del primer ministro húngaro. Estamos a la espera, todavía no ha salido nada en la CNMV. Y por cierto, hablando de mercados, de cotización, vamos a hablar ahora del universo de las microcaps y del mercado para este tipo de compañías, para las compañías más pequeñas que quieren también salir a cotizar. Es el caso de BM Growth y, como siempre, vamos a hablar de este tema con Juan Sainz de los Terreros, socio fundador de Udecta Corporate. Juan, buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes, encantado.
Bueno, Juan, uno de los principales problemas que tienen los empresarios, fundadores de empresas o de las personas que sacan adelante, por ejemplo, las startups, es conseguir financiación, ¿no? Lo que ocurre es que, claro, hay empresas a las que no les surge ahora mismo pues conseguir financiación, pero que tienen otro problema y que les cuesta mucho crecer. ¿Por qué animáis desde Udecta concretamente a los emprendedores y a los empresarios a que se animen a dar el salto a cotizar, aunque no tengan la necesidad de buscar capital?
Pues bueno, en general por todo lo que aporta. También hay que comentar, y todos sabemos, los que son empresarios saben que hoy pueden no tener esa necesidad de financiación, pero la pueden tener el año que viene, dentro de 3 meses, dentro de año y medio, y todo hay que prepararlo y hay que tener las herramientas disponibles para que cuando lo necesites puedas disponer de ella. Pero aparte, si no se necesitara, hay empresas y empresarios que se gastan mucho dinero en crecer y ven que no crecen. El cotizar te ayuda a muchas cosas, te ayuda sin duda a crecer, pero te ayuda a crecer porque te profesionalizas, porque tienes que hacer un ejercicio de transparencia, porque te auditan otras instituciones. Todo esto de que te auditen ya sea el regulador, el auditor, por profesionalizarte, por ese ejercicio de transparencia, todo esto te ayuda a conseguir más clientes, que esto es muy importante, a, por ejemplo, internacionalizarte y que esos clientes sientan un confort de empresa de otro país, qué va a pasar con esta empresa. Si está cotizando, saben que van a estar informados, saben que ya se ha hecho un ejercicio interno fuerte para, pues eso, profesionalizarlo y ser transparente. Todo esto te hace conseguir clientes, pero también proveedores, que para las empresas también es clave, sin duda, el conseguir que trabajes con buenos proveedores. Entonces, todo esto de cotizar, ese sello de calidad que te da cotizar, yo creo que ayuda y mucho a crecer. Y para el que piense que solo la bolsa ayuda a financiarte, que piense en todo lo que hemos comentado ahora mismo de pues poder conseguir mayores clientes, mejores, nuevos proveedores, ese ejercicio de profesionalización y, por lo tanto, sin duda que animamos a por lo menos que se informen y que vean las posibilidades que da cotizar en bolsa.
En cuanto a las empresas que sí necesitan financiación, ¿por qué pensáis que no se acercan más a los mercados de valores y dan el salto a cotizar?
Sí, la verdad es que en el BM Group tenemos en empresas en expansión, quitando las OCIMIS, unas 50, redondeando aproximadamente 50 compañías, pymes, algunas ya no son tan pymes, pero son pocas. Desde nuestro punto de vista creemos que debían acercarse mucho más, pero el principal problema yo creo que es desconocimiento. Muchos empresarios con los que hablamos desde Udecta y lo que vemos es que piensan que la bolsa no es para ellas, que son como muy pequeñas empresas para cotizar en bolsa. Todo esto viene por una falta de información que no es así, el que piensen que son pequeñas, el que piensen que es muy caro. Yo, sin duda, lo decía antes, animo a que se informen, a que vean a otras compañías que están cotizando, que en muchos casos, también hablando con empresarios y emprendedores, han visto que cotizan otras empresas más pequeñas que ellas y dicen, pero si esta factura la mitad que yo y vale el doble que lo que pienso que vale mi empresa. Por lo tanto, ni son tan pequeñas, están los mercados ya adaptados para las pymes. De hecho, se ha creado uno nuevo el verano pasado para dar acceso a más compañías a las bolsas, y yo creo que es un tema de desconocimiento y de falta de información, que en cuanto se informen y vean otros ejemplos y otros casos de éxito, seguro que se animan y ven las posibilidades que hay para financiarte. Y luego que se olviden un poco de verdad de lo caro que es. Sin duda, lo más caro es no financiarte, necesitar financiación y no financiarte. Por ese motivo yo creo que es importante que se informen y que vean las posibilidades que da cotizar en bolsa.
En ese sentido, Juan, ¿cuál sería la facturación necesaria de una pyme para que pueda planear cotizar en bolsa?
Sí, pues se ha fijado como si dijéramos 1 millón de euros. 1 millón de euros sería una facturación anual mínima para plantearte cotizar, pero si nos fijamos no es una cifra inamovible, en el sentido de que hay empresas que facturan o han facturado menos de 1 millón de euros y han salido a cotizar. 1 millón te lo ponen como referencia y dices, oye, si facturas 1 millón ya puedes plantearte cotizar, pero si no lo facturas y sobre todo hay 1 millón de euros de financiación o de inversores que han puesto dinero en la compañía para un proyecto, también te puedes plantear cotizar. Y de hecho es que, como digo, hay ejemplos muy claros y muy fácil de ver que facturan incluso cotizando menos de 1 millón de euros y están cotizando. Pero bueno, como referencia, a partir de 1 millón, que son muchísimas las compañías en España que facturan 1 millón o más de manera anual, se podrían plantear el cotizar en bolsa.
Uno de estos mercados de valores, Juan, dirigidos a pymes, es el BME Scale Up. A día de hoy seguimos sin ver ninguna empresa cotizando en él. ¿Cuándo pensáis que puede llegar el primer toque de campana?
Pues sí, se comunicó e inició, como si dijéramos, el mercado su andadura en el verano de 2023, el verano pasado. Parece que está costando un poco más el encontrar, sobre todo el encontrar empresas que por lo menos se acerquen al mercado y digan, oye, que quiero cotizar y que de alguna manera abran el libro para empezar a cotizar y prepararse. Hay una que está cerca, parece, que es H2PLT, una empresa del sector del hidrógeno verde, y pensamos que debería salir en este primer trimestre o como mucho en el primer semestre de este 2024. Yo creo que el acelerón vendrá en el segundo semestre del año, en la segunda parte del año, y que este primer trimestre y segundo trimestre del año será un poco para ir preparando a compañías, pero que veamos más toques de campana en la segunda parte. Por lo tanto, yo creo que el primero, como tarde, se verá durante este primer semestre, pero sí que es verdad que está costando, también hay que ponerlo en valor, que cotizar lleva su tiempo y su proceso, que no es llegar y tocar la campana directamente. Tienes que hacer, pues es un trabajo de transparencia, profesionalización, ya sea en el BME Scale Up o en el BME Growth o en el Portfolio Stock Exchange. Hay varios mercados, pero sin duda yo creo que deberíamos ver en la segunda mitad del año más toques de campana y ojalá que el primero lo veamos pues en las próximas semanas, pocos meses.
Entrando ya en las cotizadas, hace unos días también comentábamos que varios insiders estaban comprando acciones de algunas de las empresas que cotizan en el BME Growth. ¿Se está manteniendo esta tendencia ahora?
Sí, la verdad es que sí, y es interesante porque hay muchas, podría decir varios nombres. Está Singular con su CEO, presidente, en Proeduca también, en Hanun, en Parlem, en Icertis, que se está haciendo también compras de acciones propias, la propia compañía. Hay en Mio Group, están Vitrus, muchas empresas, ya sean consejeros, presidentes, CEOs, consejeros delegados, están comprando acciones de sus propias empresas, por un lado porque evidentemente confían en la compañía y por otro lado por el castigo que han tenido las cotizaciones en estos 2 últimos años, que ha sido un castigo en algunos casos desde nuestro punto de vista excesivo. Eso también es lo bueno, que te permite en un momento dado comprar acciones que teóricamente pueden ser baratas si el proyecto sigue creciendo y sigue siendo positivo tanto para la empresa como para los inversores. Pero sí que es verdad que estamos viendo bastantes compras de acciones de consejeros. Making Science me viene a la cabeza también, con su consejero delegado que hizo un plan hasta $500,000 de euros de comprar de noviembre a febrero. Por lo tanto, tenemos varios nombres de insiders comprando y yo creo que es una buena señal, sin duda.
Para terminar, varias empresas que bueno, han visto cómo en bolsa cotizar les ha ayudado a crecer de manera inorgánica, es decir, comprando otras empresas. ¿Por qué cotizar en la bolsa también ayuda a las pymes a crecer de esta manera inorgánica?
Sí, sin duda, tenemos muchos casos de empresas que han crecido muchísimo de manera inorgánica comprando otras compañías, desde el gran éxito de MásMóvil, tenemos innumerables ejemplos ya en el BM Growth como en otros mercados. ¿Por qué ayuda a cotizar? Por lo que hemos hablado de la profesionalización, la transparencia. Cotizar te abre más puertas, a financiar la operación, a que si tú eres comprador y vas a un vendedor, le da cierto confort que venga una compañía cotizada a iniciar el proceso, que hay veces que es tedioso, es complicado, las emociones también influyen. Y es muy importante dar confort a la operación, y una empresa cotizada lo suele dar. Evidentemente, sin cotizar se pueden hacer muchas cosas y lo mismo que cotizado, pero cotizando, como digo, te abre puertas a más financiación, a tener ese confort de también esa empresa que no está cotizando, aunque esté cotizando, bueno, que se incluya dentro de una empresa cotizada. Por lo tanto, el atractivo, sin ninguna duda, yo creo que es mayor. Las herramientas a utilizar son más. Se puede pagar en acciones, una parte en efectivo y otra en acciones. Se pueden buscar.
Creo que hemos perdido el audio con Juan.
¿Me veis ahora?
Ahora sí.
Perdona. Bueno, en definitiva, que es más atractivo, yo creo, hacer una operación con una empresa cotizada, y la fiabilidad para el vendedor también ayuda y mucho. Y como digo, hay casos muy importantes, como puede ser el de Atris, el de Greenergy, el de MásMóvil, con adquisiciones de negocios y empresas muy potentes gracias, sin duda, a cotizar.
Pues Juan Sainz de los Tereros, socio fundador de Eudecta Corporate, como siempre es un placer tenerte para hablarnos de las cotizaciones y de los distintos mercados donde se puede salir a cotizar en España. Juan, gracias.
Gracias a vosotros, un saludo.
Con esto nos despedimos y les dejamos con Criptonegocios, con Sergio Fernández. Gracias por estar aquí.
¿Qué es Bitcoin? Hoy vamos a explicarles qué es exactamente Bitcoin, explicándoles los conceptos básicos para que entiendan esta criptomoneda de la que todo el mundo lleva años hablando. Esta explicación les servirá para saber también qué son exactamente las criptomonedas y cómo funcionan, para que puedan tener una noción un poco menos técnica de cómo funciona todo esto y a lo que nos referimos con cada término. Bitcoin es una criptomoneda o moneda virtual, concretamente la primera que fue desarrollada. Es la criptomoneda que le ha marcado el camino a todas las demás que llegaron después utilizando su tecnología. Esta tecnología es la cadena de bloques o tecnología blockchain, que también se utiliza para otras cosas. La primera de las criptomonedas fue creada por Satoshi Nakamoto, que es el seudónimo que corresponde a una persona que nadie sabe exactamente quién es, aunque sí que es cierto que ha habido muchas teorías. Esta persona publicó en 2009 un artículo en el que describía un sistema de pagos P2P al que llamó Bitcoin. Al cabo de unos meses, él mismo publicó la primera versión del software que permite gestionar la red de la moneda y que además empieza a interactuar con los primeros interesados en foros. La cantidad total de bitcoins que se emiten cada año está determinada por su algoritmo, y pasa lo mismo con el resto de criptomonedas. Bitcoin está desarrollado para que cada 4 años se